Good evening. My name is Aaron Shaheen, and I am the Community Involvement Coordinator at the New Bedford Harbor Superfund site from EPA. Today, we'll be talking about the New Bedford Harbor Superfund site. So if you're in the wrong class, you can hit the little phone leave button in the top right. But I'm sure everyone's here for that reason. And for everyone's awareness, this meeting is being recorded. Next slide. On the screen are instructions for Microsoft Teams, basically how to operate virtually. So you'll see the chat icon is that little message bubble. Next to it is the icon with the two kind of heads there that shows who the participants of the meeting are. And then if you need closed captioning, you just click on the ellipses of three dots and go to language and speech and then turn on live captions. The icon next to it is the camera. That's how you turn your camera on and off. And the one next to it is a microphone, and that's how you mute and unmute your mic. And then the far right, like I said, when you need to leave or at the end of this call, you can hit that, and that's how you hang up. For right now, the participants, your microphones and cameras are not able to be used, but when we get to the end of the presentation for question and answer, I will turn that setting on. And for people who are on the phone, you can use *6 to unmute your microphone and *9 to raise your hand. Oh, and the one thing I'll mention that's not pointed out here is next to the people icon, there's the raise hand function. So when we get to questions, I'll remind everyone, but that's kind of what we want to use to make sure that, we get people in order. And next slide. So these are the ground rules for online participation. So our requests are keep your microphone muted when not speaking. That's currently happening, but especially during Q&A when people are talking. We're happy to answer anyone's questions, but try to respect time limits for questions and comments. Keep the comments and chats respectful and appropriate for public audience, and just follow my guidance and instructions how to participate. And I'll be monitoring the chat. So if people have questions throughout the meeting, I can help. And next slide. Now I will introduce members of the project team. This list does not include the attorneys and risk assessors that work on the project from EPA, but still want to note their contribution to the project anyway. So in this list, we have myself, Aaron Shaheen. I'm the Community Involvement Coordinator. Dave Dickerson, he is the Remedial Project Manager. Chris Kelly, who is another remedial project manager who's new to working on the site. Marie Eston, who's from the Army Corps of Engineers, who's not on this call, and then Paul Craffey, who's from the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. He's the state project manager, and he's on this call as well. Next slide. So this is the agenda for the meeting, so I'll just read through it real quick. First, we'll review the 2024 accomplishments, and then we'll go into the 2025 remedial work. Obviously, it's already June of 2025, so we'll kind of recap what's been done so far, and then what the lookout is for the rest of the year. We'll talk about the seafood consumption advisories again, the community involvement plan that we're updating, and the kind of special part of this update that, usually consists of, the first three things. The fifth thing we had here is a document called an explanation of significant differences. So towards the end of the presentation, Dave will present a document that I just mentioned. We call it ESD for short. He'll present that in greater detail, and this is the 7th ESD for the site. For background, an ESD is a change to a component of a cleanup that does not fundamentally alter the overall cleanup approach. And there are three types of changes EPA can make to a cleanup plan. First is non-significant or minor. Second is significant, which is the middle level, which is what we have here. And then the highest level is what we call fundamental. And if none of those words make sense to you, the way I can explain it is like you're modifying a house. So a non-significant change would be like you got a new couch. A significant change would be like you got new windows or siding. And a fundamental change would be you're building an entire new story to the house or have a new foundation. So you're changing the overall cleanup approach for a project. So that's kind of the best way I like to think of it, because sometimes, even to me, those words don't make sense. So the draft ESD presentation, and I'm saying draft because it's not final until we go through the public comment periods. Right now, it's still considered draft until we get your comments and we actually finalize it. But the draft ESD presentation will discuss the 10 sediment cap areas, changing the target cleanup levels for PCBs from 50 to 25 parts per million along the Riverwalk, land use controls, or we just call them institutional controls, and the upcoming 30-day public comment period. And with that, I will hand it over to Dave to present.
Thank you, Aaron. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Thank you all for tuning in this evening, taking the time out of your day to listen to what we have. We have a lot to report, and as Aaron mentioned, the ESD to talk about. But I thought I'd start with the aerial photo of the Upper Harbor, since that's where a lot of the work that we'll be talking about is located. And big thanks to Fairhaven resident Ed Pepin for providing all the aerial shots free of charge. For reference, the former Aerovox site, the primary source of the PCB contamination, is located up here. This big smokestack I'll be using for a reference to as we move through the presentation. Sorry for the busyness of this slide, but the harbor cleanup team has been busy. This is kind of the summary list of last year, 2024. Don't worry about all these different areas. They are shown on the next slide, but we completed the salt marsh plantings at East Zone 2 and 3. We completed remediation and plantings at West Zone 2 and 3. I'll talk more about all these as we go through. We completed offsite disposal of what we call Cell 1 at the Sawyer Street Support Facility in New Bedford, and started offsite disposal of soils underneath Cell 1. I have to keep reminding that this is 2024 because we've now completed that, as we'll talk more about. We completed the redredging of some small areas north of the Wood Street, Slocum Street Bridge. We've been doing a lot of monitoring and maintenance of remediated shorelines and sediment caps, as we'll talk about. Number 6, we've been performing, as we always do, a lot of different environmental monitoring programs. But in 2024 was the first year of post-cap monitoring of the Lower Harbor CAD cell. And we've also installed some new fish consumption signage. We'll go through all of these in the subsequent slides. Yeah, so this is a figure just showing locations of those various activities. This is the north of Wood Street, we call it. Some small areas apparently got recontaminated from the large volume of remedial dredging performed just to the south. The tide does continue up here, so although the subtile dredging program was substantively completed in 2020, we did do a lot of follow-up sampling just to understand the site, and that identified some moderately contaminated areas that we wanted to remove up here. East Zones 2 and 3, these were actually excavated and backfilled in 2023, but we've learned only to plant the salt marsh plants, the native salt marsh grasses and such, in the spring planting window. So those were done, the plantings were done in East Zone 2 and 3. West Zone 2 and 3 in 2024, we did both the excavation and backfill and the planting. And then Cell 1 down here at the Sawyer Street facility again, that was a holding cell, originally constructed as part of the hotspot dredging operations, but repurposed as a holding cell for some very contaminated sediments that were dredged offshore of the Aerovox site. I believe it was 2008. Those were all dewatered and transported off-site and has since been backfilled. Just some pictures of some of that work. This is the redredging of the north of the Wood Slocum Street Bridge. This is taken at low tide. You can see a temporary stone access road is built. The excavator can get right out there, and it's all data driven as to horizontally and vertically how deep the contamination that needs to be removed is. And it swings around and empties the contaminated sediment into a lined roll-off container. This is then transported to the Sawyer Street facility where Cell 1 is for further dewatering and trucking off site. This photo shows the West Zone 2 and 3 excavation in progress. Contractor Sevenson has methodically been working in this photo north to south. This is the big smokestack I mentioned. And again, it's all data driven as to how deep to dig. But you can see this is a fringing salt marsh. It's very typical on the New Bedford side, and that's been removed along with the underlying soils. And that will all get backfilled and reconstructed and replanted as part of the restoration effort. Should mention this photo also shows the landward edge of one of the sediment caps that we'll be talking about. All the caps have a armored top surface. And you can see that at low tide. So that's what that is. This is a photo just showing after all that excavation and backfilling and planting has been done. Again, this is West Zone 2 and 3. These stakes are part of the herbivory deterrent system. We have to keep the Canadian geese out because they love to eat our new salt marsh plugs. There's a shot of the tens of thousands of salt marsh plugs, many tens of thousands of salt marsh plugs that have been planted in New Bedford Harbor now. This is East Zone 2. Airlock site is in the background for reference. Again, this is after the excavation of contaminated sediments and after the clean backfill has been placed, we then do the restoration plantings. Talk a little bit about restoration monitoring. The point here is that we don't just reconstruct the remediated salt marsh areas, we monitor and maintain them for at least 5 years. We kind of focus on 3 main areas of interest. We want to keep sparse vegetation to a minimum. We have a 75% native species standard. We want to identify and map invasive species and make sure we have a treatment plan in place. That's what these yellow dots are, and the purple dots. Yellow is the Phragmites, and purple is purple loosestrife. I will note that this whole area prior to the remediation would be shown as yellow. It was a huge kind of monoculture Phragmites swamp. And we also look for erosional areas and fix them as needed. And just another shot of restoration monitoring. What I find remarkable about this shot is that there's nothing really remarkable. It looks pretty natural. But actually what we're looking at, this is the landward edge of one of the sediment caps. Again, at low tide, you can just see the landward edge of the armor stone that's on top of the caps. This is in the West Zone 4 area. We use the identification terminology here, L014. That's just the node location. We've established a grid system for our conformational sampling and dredging program. And this particular area had a lot of debris, as well as a lot of oil sheening, I believe, from a nearby leaking underground storage tank. So a cap was placed there. We'll talk more about this later. Another shot of restoration monitoring. Happy to report that we've observed that oysters are recolonizing, self-colonizing in several areas of the Upper Harbor. I'm not going to say exactly where. We don't want people harvesting them. But that's a very good sign. They weren't there before, I can tell you that. Moving to the Sawyer Street Support Facility and Cell 1. This is Sawyer Street. This is Market Basket. This is Riverside Park. And this is our Sawyer Street support area. This is the Cell 1, as I mentioned, previously contained some highly contaminated dredge material from near the Airbox site. That's all been removed. Even soils underneath the Cell 1 were tested and removed down to 1 part per million part PCBs. It's now backfilled with clean material. Again, this is all 2024 work. There's been a lot of work still in 2025 in this area. Moving to the Superfund Lower Harbor CAD cell, realize many people don't know what a CAD cell is. In summary, It's a large excavation in the harbor bottom in which contaminated sediments are carefully placed, allowed to settle and consolidate. And then once consolidation has taken place, in this case, a 3-foot sand cap is placed on top. They're used pretty regularly now for contaminated navigational sediments. There's 5 navigational CAD cells in New Bedford Harbor. Providence Harbor has some. Boston Harbor has some. Portland Harbor in Maine has some. I believe there's some in Connecticut too. So we just kind of took a page from the navigational dredging playbook and initiated and implemented a Superfund CAD cell for the lower level PCB contaminated sediments. And that CAD cell was filled, substantively filled in the 2020-2021 timeframe, allowed to consolidate. It was capped in 23. And so in 24, we did the first year of post-cap monitoring. I should mention, I say we have EPA has a cooperative agreement with the Port of New Bedford. They've been doing this monitoring since they're out there doing similar type of monitoring on the navigational CAD cells. Should point out that the navigational CAD cells are part of the state enhanced remedy. So with that background, happy to report that all the types of monitoring, we do 3 types of monitoring. Also, that the cap is functioning as designed. Everything looks good. The port has done 3 rounds of bathymetry. That's mapping of the elevation of the harbor bottom. Looks like the surface, the harbor bottom is kind of in a steady state condition. Some consolidation as expected, but even consolidation, not differential settlement. Through cap cores, verified that the 3-foot cap remains in place. I think we had 10 locations that we tested. Similarly, the sediment chemistry had 10 locations. Most of them were non-detect for PCBs. The highest one was 0.07. To quote our colleague Paul Craffey at Mass DEP, these CAD cells are going to be the cleanest, cleanest places in the lower harbor from a PCB standpoint. So that's 2024, moving right into 2025. Another laundry list of work that the harbor team has been doing. I should point out that EPA has an interagency agreement with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the Corps and their contractors are the ones that are actually implementing the work with EPA's oversight. But number 1 here, cells 1 and 2 at the Sawyer Street Support Facility, all the material in them have been removed off site, including contaminated soils underneath them. Again, down to 1 part per million PCBs, which is the residential standard. Coming up here shortly this summer is construction of the pilot CDF cap at Sawyer Street. I'll be talking a lot about that in the next few slides. Demobilization at Sawyer Street facilities. You know, we're done with all the in-water work. So we're doing the final remediation at the Sawyer Street facility. It looks a lot different out there if anyone has been by recently. Demobilization means removal of, various equipment. Eventually the office trailers would go, that type of thing. We continue to monitor and maintain the salt marshes and sediment caps. We continue to do fish consumption outreach, talk more about that. And per the Superfund statute, we are doing another 5-year review this year. This is another aerial view of the Sawyer Street facility. This is the pilot CDF area. This is, CDF is a confined disposal facility. It's basically just a containment area, isolation area for mildly contaminated sediments, I'll say. This was built in the late 80s, early 90s. The surface of the pilot CDF has been used for site operations, but now that those operations are coming to a close. It's time to cap the CDF, and will only be 5 feet high for positive drainage, so that any rainwater and snow melt, gets shed away from the pilot CDF rather than percolating through. So it'll kind of look like a grassy knoll when we're done. Talk a little bit more about that as well. Number 2, cells 1 and 2, again, all these soils have been removed, including underneath them. That was completed in February. And backfilling of those was completed in May of this year. And site demobilization again continues. This is a photo of what the area looked like in December. It was a busy beehive. This is the removal operation of the cell 1 soils. This is staged backfill, clean backfill, waiting to be placed. And this is the pilot CDF area. And interestingly, we've started to think about how this area will look in the future. We coordinate closely with the City of New Bedford staff, and it is city property. And this is kind of the redevelopment concept. Most of the area will be clean for redevelopment. Pilot CDF, the grassy knoll, will be along the shore. This red dashed line is meant to indicate the location, the rough location of New Bedford's planned Riverwalk. You'll see it will kind of follow along the edge of the shore and connect with the abutting Riverside Park. And when we were discussing this with the city, they said, hey, can you do an artist rendering? And they didn't really have a good feel for what it would look like. So we went ahead and did that, and it turns out it's pretty easy to do if you have a good GIS person, which the course contractor Jacobs did have. And so this is their interpretation of what it would look like. This is the pilot CDF. This is the Riverwalk. Take the planting detail with a heavy grain of salt, because it's not really going to look just like that. We're going to use a conservation seed mix, so it would be kind of a mix of native grasses and wildflowers. Look different at different times of the year. That's the overhead view. We also did a kind of a ground level view. Again, just to bring home the point that it's only about a 5-foot high cap, not a 50-foot high landfill type deal. Again, it's not going to look like this highly maintained manicured garden. It's going to be more of a wild meadow type of look. At the risk of beating a dead horse, just to show that the Riverwalk plan is developing, proceeding. This is the preliminary design plans from the city of New Bedford. This is the Market Basket parking lot. You can see the Riverwalk will again hug the shore, link up with the Sawyer Street site, hug the shoreline, and continue on northward. Okay, so that is kind of a quick summary of the 2025 work. We'd like to pivot now to the fish consumption restrictions and advisories. It's kind of an interesting problem to have because, as I've tried to describe, all the in-river remediation is done. The river is full of fish eating birds like ospreys and eagles, and the fishermen are having a great time out there. This gentleman we happened to see a couple of weeks ago when I was taking Chris Kelly around, our new RPM for the site. And he was happy to report that he caught this, I think it was a 34-inch striped bass, and he's standing on the Arabach shoreline. First thing we said is, you're not supposed to eat the fish. He said yes, but it's still valuable recreational, catch and release. But the point I'm trying to make is, even though all the remediation is done, even all the river is full of fish are pretty much full of PCBs still. And the computer modeling that was done estimates it'll take about 10 years or so. It's a lag time. The PCBs bioaccumulate within the food chain, and even though the sediments are clean, it takes a while for the PCBs to kind of depurate out of the marine organisms. We did come up with a new signage format shown here. Kind of a difficult message to get across succinctly, but we felt that using the navigational chart as a backdrop would be a good way to do it, since fishermen are essentially going out in their boats as well as fishing from the shore. But there's 3 areas per the 1979 Mass Department of Public Health fish consumption closure regulations. North of the barrier, you don't want to eat anything. Area 2, don't really want to eat much there either, but quahogs, it's all data driven, are showing from a PCB standpoint, not necessarily a bacterial standpoint, it's acceptable once a month, once a week if you're over here in Clark's Cove. As you get further afield in Area 3, some of the consumptions recommendations start to relax. Scup, black sea bass, and conch are okay once a month. Quahog and tautog once a week, that type of thing. There is a QR code that shows the non-English translations, health information, and fish identification photos too. So with that, I'm going to hand the baton over to Aaron to talk a little bit about more of the seafood outreach that we've been doing.
Great. Thanks, Dave. So like Dave said, we do seafood outreach to try to educate people. So EPA continues to work with the City of New Bedford and the Community Economic Development Center to conduct surveys around the harbor. So these surveys gather seafood consumption information from people, in and around the harbor, try to meet people at hot fishing spots, things like that. And the coordinators share information about EPA seafood consumption recommendations. So they have a fact sheet, and they have also kind of the signage on a piece of paper to give people that talks about them. So the great part about the partnership is that the coordinators speak multiple language, which makes surveys more accessible. So I only speak one language, which is, and people in New Bedford, I grew up there. A lot of people speak Portuguese, speak Cape Verdean Creole, Spanish. We even translate to Vietnamese. So lots of different languages, and these coordinators actually speak those. And that's very helpful in terms of communicating with people. And kind of the overall results show that we need to continue to educate people more about the recommendations. People are still saying, that they're consuming, and I've heard that in some interviews I've done recently. So we're going to keep educating people about the recommendations. And Dave, you can go to the next slide. So going off the need for more education, we are updating the community involvement plan for the site. So community involvement plan, use the acronym CIP for short. So the CIP provides the backbone of the community involvement program and serves as a useful resource that the site team often turns to during the Superfund cleanup process for advice on appropriate activities for community involvement. Basically, gives an overview of the site, talks about the community, and we do interviews to gather information about concerns people have and the best ways to communicate. And since we're at a point where, had Dave mentioned, we're demobilizing, and we're still going to be monitoring the fish population, we thought this would be a good time to figure out how to reach people. I've conducted some interviews already, and I'll continue to take some requests over the next week, but I would like to finalize this, late June, early July, so people can see kind of what the notes they had given me and the conversations that we had. And if you'd like to be interviewed, you can email me, emails at the bottom of the screen, or just give me a call and we can set something up. And I'll write that information in the chat too, in case you want to save it. And I think with that, Dave, I'm going back to you at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Now we want to get into the ESD portion of tonight's meeting. Again, we're having a public comment period starting tomorrow, a 30-day comment period running until July 10th. As Aaron mentioned earlier up front, it's going to this ESD, the explanation of significant differences, will cover 3 things. Sediment cap alternatives. Sediment caps, as we'll talk about, are areas that, in a nutshell, didn't make sense to dredge, or we couldn't dredge, and so we installed caps instead. We'll talk a lot about that coming up. Second item is use of a recreational versus industrial land use cleanup level along the Upper Harbor shoreline in New Bedford, abutting the Riverwalk. So in other words, a 25 versus a 50 part per million PCB cleanup level. And the ROD was written in '98. This part of the shoreline was pretty much all industrial commercial, and that pointed to a 50 part per million cleanup level. With the Riverwalk coming online, that would be more of a recreational land use, and so a 25 part per million level is, we believe, called for. And the ESD will also talk about and clarify the use of institutional controls, which is kind of a Superfund term for non-engineering controls, such as bylaws or deed notices, to prevent human contact risk where PCB levels remain in place above unrestricted use levels. This slide shows the 10 areas in red where sediment caps were placed. Again, these are areas where dredging was not considered feasible, advisable, or cost effective with the available equipment. There's kind of 3 different reasons at a minimum why we put caps, one of which is where we had abutting shoreline structures like the Cottrell Street Bridge or the Pilot CDF berm, or some other locations that had old seawalls that we didn't want to dredge right next to them for fear of undermining the structural integrity of these structures. Second reason was a lot of these areas had a heavy amount of debris in the sediment. And in a lot of cases, both reasons were in play. At Cottrell Street Bridge area, turns out they built a temporary bridge when they built this new bridge, and that was demolished in place. So there's all kinds of debris there that makes dredging impossible. Similar issues at many of these other sites, a lot of old demolition debris. The third reason is to prevent PCB migration from groundwater upwelling into the river. We'll talk a little bit about that more as well. Maybe I should back up for a second, realizing that most of you may not have the foggiest idea what a sediment cap is, but I'd say they have a long track record as a tool in the toolbox for sediment remediation. I know of one Superfund site that was a big lake. The entire remedy was a cap. And recently saw the fish tissue data 10 years after capping, and the PCB levels in fish were a couple orders of magnitude, 100 times lower than previous to capping. So, as I said, they have a long track record. They're highly engineered and designed. And in general, in New Bedford's case, they kind of have 2 layers if you want to simplify it down. The first level layer, as we'll talk more about, is an isolation layer that has a specified amount of total organic carbon. And that's what's doing the work, as PCBs might be upwelling in groundwater to the river, which groundwater generally wants to go to. The carbon strips out the PCBs, much like a water filter strips out organics in a water filter. And then the second layer is a kind of an armor stone top layer to preserve the isolation layer over time. This is a shot of the Cottrell Street Bridge. Landward edge of the sediment cap. This is the armor stone I was talking about. You can also see it on the other side in Fairhaven. Again, there was a lot of debris here, and we didn't, out of an abundance of caution, we didn't want to dredge right up next to the bridge embankment for fear of undermining the structural integrity. This is kind of an infographic we put together to hopefully make the point that, and this is specifically for the Airvox site, where the upland cleanup has been lagging. I shouldn't say has been, it was lagging at the time that we did the remedial dredging. This cleanup for the state program hadn't been completed. So there was a concern that there might be PCB migration into the river. And so this really robust high TOC, total organic carbon, cap was placed. Again, as you get contaminated groundwater migrating upward, that carbon strips out the PCBs, and turns out there's a lot of TCE, trichloroethylene, at the Airvox area, and prevents those contaminants from getting into the river. Been doing a lot of monitoring that shows that that's been effective. We looked at 3 alternatives for the sediment caps. A little wordy here, but real quick, alternative 1 was to incorporate the sediment caps as elements of the remedy. In other words, if you read the 1998 record of decision, it just talks about dredging. It doesn't talk about sediment caps. So these caps, we call them interim caps at this point because they're not part of the remedy until we finalize the ESD. And although they're considered interim sediment caps, they were highly designed, lots of engineering, careful construction, so that they would stand the test of time and be permanent if we wanted to keep them in place. And that happens to be EPA's proposal. We'll talk more about that. Alternative 2 is to remove the sediment caps and perform the dredging that was specified in the 1998 ROD, but it would be a completely different type of dredging with completely different associated operations. We believe we'd have to do sheet piling to protect the nearby abutting shoreline structures like the bridge and the Pilot CDF berm and some of the old seawalls. Heavier duty equipment to strip out all the debris in these areas, as well as backfilling and sheet pile removal. So it's a completely different type of dredging that we're talking about here. Alternative 3, another alternative we looked at was remove the sediment caps and implement in situ bioaugmentation. Basically, that means once you remove the caps and get to the underlying PCB contaminated sediment, you'd place certain specific microbes amended with activated carbon so that hopefully over time, the microbes, just as part of the normal metabolism, would feed on the PCBs and lower the PCB level. Unfortunately, that hasn't really yet been proven effective at full scale, but we did keep it as an alternative. There is quite a lengthy alternative analysis report that looks at all of these in much more detail, evaluates the 3 alternatives I just mentioned against the Superfund criteria listed here: overall protectiveness, compliance with laws and regulations, implementability, short-term effective, long-term effectiveness and permanence, use of treatment and cost. As I mentioned, the draft ESD does recommend alternative 1, incorporating the sediment caps as permanent elements of the remedy, along with long-term monitoring and maintenance. Just because they're effective, they all the data and evaluations and this is where I'm looking for inspections show that they're doing fine. They seem to be permanent. They've already been implemented. The cost is low and initial state concurrent as well. Did do cost estimates for all of these, as you might expect. These are the 3 alternatives: keep caps in place, remove caps, perform the special dredging I mentioned, remove caps and then perform in situ bioaugmentation. We did construction costs, we did 30-year operations and maintenance costs, and we also did something called a net present value, which kind of brings it down to a baseline. You can see the costs here. Yes, keeping the caps in place is the least expensive, but we did spend a fair amount of money putting them in place. But we didn't select this because it's the lowest cost. We selected it because we believe they're effective and there will be no further short-term or long-term impacts. If we had to remove the caps and perform the dredging, there'd be a lot of impacts, potential air quality issues, water quality issues, and importantly, when you do this remedial dredging, you don't get down to 0 parts per million PCBs. Yet the surface of the caps, yes, they are at 0 parts per million PCBs because cap material was tested and it was clean. By which I mean 0 parts per million PCBs. So that's the sediment caps. The second ESD issue, as we've mentioned, is use of a more stringent 25 part per million versus 50 part per million cleanup level along the Riverwalk. I don't think I've mentioned that we actually have already used the 25 part per million cleanup level because we knew Riverwalk was coming. We didn't want to slow down the remediation of these intertidal shoreline areas. We're just trying to memorialize that in the ESD. Again, this brown area, this brown line is the proposed Riverwalk. This is Market Basket. This is the pilot CDF. And again, the Riverwalk which kind of hug the shoreline. We saw this shot earlier, just trying to convey with this red dashed line a little awkwardly, but hopefully it brings the point home. But that's about where the Riverwalk would be. So it's not right in the areas that we remediated, but it's right next to. So you might imagine people walking their dogs and the dog going in here, or people chasing footballs or frisbees, and it just makes sense to use a recreational standard rather than a commercial industrial standard, we think. Again, this is the landward edge of one of the sediment caps. This particular cap, we call it the crib cap because there are these two big wooden, we call them crib structures, that were water intake structures for the mills. The mills used to use river water for fire suppression. So there's all kinds of pipes and valves and features in the sediments that just really prevented dredging, effective dredging. So with that, I'm going to hand the baton over to Chris Kelly to talk a little bit about the public comment period.
All right, thanks, Dave. Hello, everyone. I guess we're somewhat of an intimate group here, but it's a chance to introduce myself. My name is Chris Kelly. I'll be assuming project management duties for the new Bedford Harbor site from Dave in the coming days. Been with EPA over 6 years now, and I've worked in Superfund for several years prior to that. So excited to join the project, and thank you for joining and listening to us. I think that was the main reason I was supposed to come and talk, was to introduce myself, because talking about the institutional controls is maybe the least exciting of the topics that we have, because there's no visuals to share. But in the explanation of significant differences, we're going to explain the necessity. EPA is explaining the necessity for institutional controls, the non-engineered controls that Dave had mentioned earlier, for any area where PCB remediation occurred and was not clean to residential standards, which is 1 part per million. So there were several of those areas, my understanding, but a good portion of the upper and lower harbor were remediated to either 25 or 50 parts per million. And so until those levels reach a point at which there is unrestricted use or an unlimited exposure scenario, institutional controls are required. And that was called for in the 1998 ROD for OU1, the record of decision. So that's all I have to say about the ICs, as we call them at EPA. The next slide, I think, deals with the public comment period, so you can advance. So you have 3 different options following your review of the ESD to submit comments to EPA. for us to review and respond to before we finalize any sort of change to the remedy at the site. These are ordered in preference of how we'd like to receive the comments. The first being an email sent straight to me. You can write your comment as the body text of the email. You can attach a PDF. You can attach a Word document to the email and send it to me, and it will be recorded and responded to. The next option is using the Superfund docket on regulations.gov, which is maybe a little bit more formal, but is a perfectly acceptable way to submit comments on the official docket. So that's the URL right there. And we also have posted the hyperlink on the New Bedford Harbor website that EPA hosts. And the third option, which is still available to the general public, is sending regular mail comments to me. My address is in the body text of the ESD number 7. So you'll have to address it to me as the project manager of the New Bedford Harbor site and send it to the correct mail code at our office in Boston. So those are the 3 main ways that you can comment.
All right. Thanks, Chris. So let me do one thing before we start this. Give everyone access to their cameras and microphones. All right, cool. Okay, awesome. That worked. So I'm gonna do one thing just to show everyone where they're going to be able to go to the regulations.gov before we start question and answers. So let me just share my screen real quick.
Hey, Aaron, I just want to say, if anyone has questions about what Dave or I just talked about, ask away in this forum. However, what you say to us is not really considered a formal comment. This is not a public hearing. This is just a question and answer session.
Yeah.
Just and we don't have a stenographer taking down the comments. I'm not writing them down. Dave's not writing them down. If you do have a formal comment after you review the document, hopefully submit it that way.
Yeah, and the comment period starts tomorrow. So you can see the website here right now. It says public meetings and it talks about the public meeting tonight, but tomorrow morning I have it scheduled for, I will double check. This first slide, number 1 right here, so you can just click on number 1, will say public comment. It'll talk about us releasing a document, and then there'll be a blue box here that will go right to the online regulations.gov docket. And if you want to submit your comment that way online, you can do that. So that's where it will be. I have it scheduled to do tomorrow morning, so people can start submitting their comments after review document. And I'll also show you real quick the administrative record. So basically, that is all of the documents that aren't the draft ESD but are related to it. You can view that here. So you click on this link, and then so the ESD is in there as well, but to make it easier, I put the actual ESD under this yellow box right here. It says new. You click on this and you could view it. So that's where everything is. If you have questions, just ask Chris or I, and we'll help you find or send you a copy of it. But that's where you can find it online and to comment if you don't email Chris or send something in the mail. So I will stop sharing, and we'll get into some Q&A. So like we kind of talked about in the beginning, there's like that raise hand function at the top next to the people icon. If you have a question, feel free to put that hand up, and then I'll just call on you and ask away. So with that being said, does anyone have any questions for us now? Or you can just come off mute too. You can just come off mute and talk as well if you have any questions, or say something in the chat. Come on, it's gotta be one question. Somebody has to ask something. Let's see. Oh wait, we have one in the chat here. I'll read this out loud for everyone. But Heidi asks, can you elaborate on the PCB thresholds? It sounds like you had originally targeted 50 parts per million for the Riverwalk and other areas. My understanding is that 50 parts per million PCBs is a standard for hazardous waste, not something that would be considered acceptable for a recreational area. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Little bit of misunderstanding, perhaps. The 1998 ROD uses a menu of different cleanup levels that were picked after careful consideration, weighing a variety of factors. A lot of the risk assessments pointed to a 1 part per million cleanup level that would have resulted in radical alterations of the salt marsh and rest of the harbor. The lower harbor is designated port area. The 50 part per million cleanup level that was used for intertidal areas was meant for commercial industrial land use, not recreational or residential use. Recreational use, and its all risk assessment is based on how many exposures a year. Yeah, so 50 was based on dermal contact X times a year in commercial, industrial, kind of remote areas where you wouldn't expect much dermal contact. I think it's 24 or so exposure scenarios a year, if memory serves. The recreational dermal contact threshold is 25 part per million. Again, it's just a risk assessment calculation. I don't happen to know off the top of my head how many times a year that is safe for, but it's very robust. And then for residential intertidal dermal contact, it's a 1 part per million. For subtidal areas and mudflats in the upper harbor, we use a 10 part per million cleanup level, knowing that we get below that during the dredging process. And for the lower harbor, given that it's a designated port area, we selected 50 part per million cleanup level for subtidal and mudflats. And we approved the state's request for a state enhanced remedy so the navigational dredging could kind of extend the environmental benefits of dredging in this particular circumstance. So another way of saying that is the Superfund dredging did about 1 million cubic yards of dredging total. The state enhanced remedy navigational dredging program did another 1 million cubic yards of dredging. Above and beyond that, there is a little over 100,000 cubic yards of intertidal soils and sediments that were excavated. So that's kind of the thumbnail sketch of the different cleanup levels. Hope that makes sense.
All right. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to come off mute, or you can put it in the chat, and I'll give people a minute in case they're typing. Actually, while people are doing that, I will show everyone where to find the fish consumption regulations in translations on the website in different languages. So if you're on the website, you go to slide 4 here, you can click on this link and it'll bring you to a page that talks about the fish consumption regulations. And if you click on this link right here to bring you down, and it has that sign that David showed in the slides earlier that talks about the state 1979 regulations and also our recommendations, and it has in all different languages here. So if someone's looking for that, that's where you'll find it. And that QR code is going to go to this spot right here. It's either going to go to here or here, I forget, but it'll go here, and that's where you can find the sign in different languages. So that will stop sharing. All right. Well, I don't hear any other questions or see any other questions for anyone. But feel free to, I'll put my information to the chat. You can find contact information for Dave and Chris in the ESD. If you have any questions, reach out. But 30-day public comment period starts tomorrow, ends on July 10th. So if you have comments in the ESD form, if you want them formally included, send them to Chris or use regulations.gov or mail them. And Chris, you can go ahead.
If you have clarifying questions at the ESD, feel free to email me. It doesn't count as a formal comment. So if you need something clarified, just reach out. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. Of course. Yeah. Go through. If you have any questions at all, just let us know. But thanks everyone for joining. Anything else from anyone? Chris, Dave, you guys good?
All set, thanks.
All right. Thanks everyone. And have a good night.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care.